Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the enormous privilege of serving as the president of Hunter College, where, on campus or online, the American dream continues to come true. Our founder, Thomas Hunter, was ahead of his time when he established our school in 1870, insisting on building an institution to educate both women and students of all races, religions, countries of origins, and economic means. This was an extraordinarily progressive vision then, and now, 150 years later, this vision remains the defining pillar of Hunter's structural commitment to expanding diversity and opportunity. We strive every day in every way to fulfill the Hunter motto, Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine. These days, as you know so well, the fabric of our society is under renewed strain. Our national commitment to civil and human rights is again being tested. A pandemic threatens us, and a long overdue reckoning with racial injustice demands our attention. In response, Hunter College has directed fresh energy to making sure the future becomes healthier and more equitable for our students, our faculty, our school, and our city. We are committed to working together to level the systemic disparities that have prevented us from achieving a more perfect union. Here at Hunter, we are developing specific new initiatives for a more inclusive learning and working environment. A presidential task force will explore strategies to enhance the curriculum and advance equality in a profoundly welcoming environment. We are also adding new counseling services to help students navigate these challenging times, and we will seek common ground and hopefully collective inspiration by assigning incoming students to read and discuss a faculty-selected book addressing the impact of racism. 3 weeks ago, we launched a new series of online public programming called Speaking of Justice, Race, Racism, and Reform, to explore the historical and political roots of racism and the urgent need to confront and cure it. In the first 3 installments, faculty, students, and special guests explored urgent and challenging policy questions. First, the historic lesson of protest movements, then the new national reckoning over memory and memorials, statutes, and symbols, and just last week, the gross inequities in public health that have been laid bare so brutally by the COVID epidemic. I want to take this opportunity to thank our brilliant faculty members and guest panelists who have participated in weekly breakout sessions for shining such a powerful light on these issues. And I thank John Rose, the Hunter's Dean of Diversity, Misha Smith and Malky Schwartz from Hunter College, and Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer for producing these programs. Tonight, in our 4th program, we are particularly proud to present Hunter Alumni, Advancing Racial Equity. Since the 1870s, Hunter College has been the alma mater of various individuals instrumental in the fight for racial equity. Think of the great feminist lawyer and civil rights advocate Pauli Murray of the class of 1933, whose legal theory that separate was inherently unequal became the basis for the Supreme Court's historic Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Think of Ruby Dee, Hunter College High School class of 39 and Hunter College class of 45, who is not only an award-winning actress, but a poet, playwright, screenwriter, journalist, and civil rights advocate. And then there is, of course, Audre Lorde, class of 1959, who wrote powerful poetry and prose that exposed the injustices of racism, sexism, and homophobia. What an extraordinary alumni legacy. And tonight, we have another group of groundbreaking graduates to take up the causes that, for all the work and sacrifice that have come before, remain in many ways unfilled. For this evening's discussion, it is a pleasure first to welcome Tamara Jean, class of 2018, a Macaulay Honors Hunter graduate and a political science media major who wrote her senior thesis on the Black Lives Matter movement. Tamara is Hunter's first Rhodes Scholar and she is currently exploring the chasm between Afro-pessimism and Black optimism at Oxford University. Tamara, it is such a joy to have you back at Hunter, even virtually, so welcome home. We are so pleased as well to introduce Tiffany McFadden, who attended and is now an adjunct professor at our Silberman School of Social Work and the logistical lead for the New York City March for Justice. She has been a champion for the families of the incarcerated and for reform of the foster care system in New York City. Tiffany, it is wonderful to have you as well. Lisa Ramadar, who graduated from Hunter in 2013, is an active and inspiring executive at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. There, she is acting director of Race to Justice, a department-wide initiative to increase professional awareness of the disparities in health services and to close the gap in health outcomes in New York. Lisa, thank you for your impactful work and for joining us tonight. Finally, it is a very special treat to introduce tonight's moderator, Melva Miller, who earned her master's degree in social work at the Silberman School in 2004. Melva is the executive vice president for the Association for the Better New York, where she heads ABNY's 2020 Census Initiative. For this crucial effort, she manages a team of social workers, urban planners, and communication professionals working with community organizations, state and city agencies, and the U.S. Census Bureau in an effort to count every single New York City resident in 2020. Hunter is proud to partner with Melva on this push to get everyone counted, and so proud of her important work in this area. Melva was previously Deputy Borough President of Queens, where she helped create the Jamaica Now Action Plan, along with countless other initiatives to create equitable tech development in her borough. Melva, we are so grateful that you joined us this spring as a Grove leader at Roosevelt House and worked with our students, and that you are with us today to lead this program. We are so proud of all of these extraordinary alumni and for their commitment to caring for the future. In the midst of our challenges, it gives me such pleasure to celebrate our alumni who are living the Hunter motto. Thank you for joining us this evening to talk about the challenges with these transformational leaders. It is my pleasure now to turn our program tonight over to Melva Miller. Thank you, Melva.
Thank you, Jennifer, President Rabb. Thank you for that great introduction and setting the stage for this evening's discussion. I'd really like to thank Hunter College and the Roosevelt House and President Rabb specifically for hosting this series. And it's the fourth in this series. I truly appreciate the commitment of President Rabb and the college for its students, its alumni, and its commitment to the city of New York. As I understand it, after the trigger of George Floyd's death, Hunter really stepped up and developed a strategy to evaluate what an institution like Hunter can do to address racial inequality in this city. And coming up with a three-part strategy to create a space for Hunter students to be supported, take an internal audit of its own practices and culture, and then assess and implement the need to educate and bring awareness to, and frankly, create the necessary discourse to bring about change, shows you exactly the type of leader Hunter College is and President Rabb. Thank you. And I'm not just saying that because I'm alum. I'm saying it because in this moment in time, it is truly important that we have leaders to step up and do these types of things. Listen, it's been a tough few months for the city and for our country. And in this time, we have an opportunity to build power and accountability. And that's what this series is about. We need to do all that we can to make sure marginalized populations are heard and are a part of any solution that affects their lives. Recent events, including the global COVID-19 pandemic and the outrage across the country about the most recent incident of police violence against an unarmed, non-threatening citizen of this country, have once again uncovered the inequalities in our society. Now, we all have a role and a part to play in this change, and we hold the power to reverse this trend and ensure that our communities are empowered to create this change as active participants, especially those who have been marginalized by oppression and racial injustice. And we're talking about building systemic power that will protect lives, That's what we're talking about today. And the frustrations that we're seeing in the streets isn't just about George Floyd. It's about folks being tired of being treated less than, and not just by the police, right? It's about protesters giving voice to their anger. And it's an anger with a bit of sadness. COVID-19 has laid bare the underlying racial injustices and disparities within our city, whether through disproportionate rates of infections and deaths in Black and Brown communities, access to healthcare, housing, economic opportunities, or through the economic devastation of job losses, an estimated 2/3 of which have been suffered by people of color in this city. Now, I'm excited about tonight's conversation. This is going to be a discussion from various perspectives on how three very established professionals associated with Hunter College, which I'm very proud of, have been able to fight for social and racial justice through their professions. As President Rabb said, we are joined by Tamara Jean, class of 2018, among many achievements, wrote her senior thesis on the BLM movement, Black Lives Matter movement. We're also joined by Tiffany McFadden, who attended and is an adjunct professor at our very own Silverman School of Social Work and a logistic lead for the New York City March of Justice. And last but definitely not least, Lisa Ramadan, who graduated from Hunter in 2013 and is an executive at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So let's jump right in, ladies. So this question is for all of you, right? You can all take a few minutes to answer this. What do you do professionally? Can you talk a little bit about what you do? And then what has been your biggest challenge in your career being a woman of color, and or working with communities to empower underrepresented, underrepresented, disadvantaged communities across New York City? So let's start with Tiffany.
Ooh. When someone asks the question, well, good evening to everyone. But the question of what I do as a professional. And so there's no straight answer. There's several things, several hats. And then I think that gets at what it means to be a Black woman in this country, and all the work that is required when you are about doing what's right. And so what I do, one of the things that I do is teach others who come to Hunter School of Social Work with the intention of wanting to help. I help take them into a deeper dive around what the origin is around you wanting to help people, and helping folks to understand the ties between social justice and moving it a step further to liberation, right? Because what we should be focused on is folks getting free. And so that's one of the things that I do. I am also a communal practitioner. So I'm always looking to position and align myself with community-based organizations that are about coordinating communal responses with communities that are vulnerable and that are working without city funding, without private funding, to take care of themselves, to take care of their families, to take care of their communities. So that's another thing that I do. The third thing that I like to lift up, because it is something that is often gone amiss and overlooked in this system, is to intervene on the behalf of particularly Black and Brown families throughout New York City who are facing possible child removal and family separation, or what the Movement for Family Power calls family regulation. And so what I do is I intervene, whether it's at the family team conference, whether it's at family court. I come to work and support the family's behalf, on the family's behalf, for them to stay together. And then when trusted and accepted into that fold, we then take a deeper dive to do work with each other to figure out how do we address the vulnerabilities so that they won't continue to be under the threat of New York City's child protective and child welfare system.
I love that you sort of classified at the beginning of sort of instructing students towards liberation, right? And I think that sounded like a theme throughout all of your work. It's like, how do we liberate communities? How do we liberate individuals? How do we liberate folks who are feeling oppressed or disadvantaged or disconnected to the system somehow? So now I actually would like Tamara to talk a little bit about her work, especially her senior thesis on Black Lives Matter movement. Could you just tell us a little bit about sort of how your profession and being a Black woman, sort of how that shaped the work that you do?
Absolutely. So professionally, I am in the early stages of my career as an academic, which means I am invested in the university and invested in knowledge production. And for me, what that means as a Black woman is that I am invested in studying and writing about the traditions that have liberated Black folks for centuries. That means on a daily basis that I am trying to connect the histories and traditions that have maintained and sustained our communities to the present moments that are happening right now. I think something that often happens when we have these visceral moments in our culture is folks start asking questions, ranging from, you know, how can stuff like this happen to how do we handle this in the immediate? And I think a lot of those questions come from the fact that we have deliberately been detached from our tradition as liberators and as survivors. And so part of my work as an academic is sort of connecting our history and tradition so those tools can be applicable in every moment that arises for us to make change. Aside from that, I also do work in the nonprofit space. I'm currently working as a special advisor on racial justice. And I think the through line for me is thinking about how racial justice penetrates into institutions, understanding that a lot of the systems and institutions that we interact with, no matter how well-meaning or no matter how benign they might seem, just by definition, are always embedded with sort of the tools of white supremacy that enable us to, or don't enable us to have access and resources to the tools that we need to fight the system as it continues to introduce barriers to us being free, as Tiffany mentioned before. This started for me in Hunter College. I was a political science major. I did come into undergrad knowing that I wanted to study politics, but I started at Hunter in 2014. That was the year Mike Brown was killed by the police. And so for me, I think it was one of the first times immediately following 2 years prior, Trayvon Martin being killed by police, where there was an uprising that was being publicly displayed everywhere you looked. So for me, my study of politics in no way, because of my identity and because of what was going on in the world, it couldn't be detached from studying liberation and studying politics through a specifically Black lens. So when it came to write my thesis, nothing else made sense. So I wanted to specifically focus on liberation, and through my studies at Hunter, I came to the understanding that the liberation movements that we revere, whether it is the Black Power movement or the Civil Rights movement or the liberation movements in the West Indies and the Caribbean in the 50s and the 70s, are all underpinned by a philosophy and all have leaders at the forefront that have ensured that our movements are not sporadic, they are not random, they are not chaotic, they are organized, they are based on philosophy, and they are always based on a foundation of making sure that not only are the folks who are oppressed get free, but everyone surrounding the society also gets free. And I wanted to think about really clearly what philosophy was underpinning the Black Lives Matter movement. And for me, as I continued my studies and went on to do my master's and now my PhD, I'm specifically thinking about how, or what it might mean for Black feminism to be put at the vanguard of our movements against racial and gender oppression. As we all know, Black women have been the foundation of every liberation movement when it comes to the oppressive structures that have happened since the time of colonialism. But we are now seeing a moment where Black women are fighting for their legacies and their traditions to be put at the forefront. And again, my part in that, as someone who is invested in unearthing history and unearthing tradition is to make sure that that information and those tools are available and accessible to communities as we begin to think about how to make our protests into practice and how to make our freedom dreams real.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tamara. And I love your sort of context from the historical perspective, right? How do we get here, right? And also, right, how could our legacy, how can our traditions sort of help us navigate this? And, you know, so as we look at sort of our community sometimes, and we look at the trauma that we face, you know, one of the biggest things that is missing is how this affects our mental health, right? And, you know, there's a lot of trauma that happens, you know, for many reasons in our community, and having a leader like Lisa at the Department of Health, I think is really important. So could you tell us again, sort of how'd you get here, your roadmap, what do you do professionally? And as a woman of color, how does that impact the work that you do?
Thank you. I have to say that when I was in public health school at Hunter, I never thought I'd be doing the work I was doing right now. And so I feel like I'm in a really privileged position to be sitting in a government organization and in a position to think about how we force that organization to confront its history of racism and the legacy of racism as it is, as I think Tamara mentioned perfectly, that white supremacy is deeply embedded in our institutions, and we're not going to get to liberation until we start to actually face that. And so where I sit in the health department and my project in Race to Justice, it's really an internal strategy project. It's not like so much of what happens in public health is about programming for communities and government taking a really paternalistic approach to public health programming, where we're sort of designing solutions for communities. And I really appreciated Tiffany naming that communities have solutions, and they have thrived with very little for a long time. And so where I sit, I feel like I have this opportunity to force the health department to really examine the way that it has moved with our communities historically, and to really start to transform the way it moves in the future. So that means for us, our focus, we call our strategy on my team an internal external strategy. We expect that in the long term, we're going to actually have real public health shifts in how we do our work, and see real reductions in health disparities with the work that we're doing. But we can't do that with an organization that's sick within. And so we want to focus on equity in the health department. So looking at our policies, our practices, the kinds of experiences that our staff have coming to work for this agency every day, noting also the demographics of government, and particularly I work for the health department. So, you know, Black women make up a huge portion of the workforce in the health department. Black and brown people are 70% of the health department. And so looking at how they are strategized in terms of power through the hierarchy in the agency, stratified, I mean, and examining the health department for its impact on its own staff, on the community within, shifting the institution internally, so that then we can start to think about how we work differently with communities. And that doesn't, I'm not trying to make this sound also that is sequential and one must happen before the other, but as we are changing the institution from within, also starting to work differently with communities, having more community engagement in our work, and thinking about how we resource for communities to do their work. Do we just go in and resource when the program is something that we think is a best practice or evidence-based, or are we actually going to resource communities to do the work that they've been doing for themselves for so long? So that is a very long-winded way to say that I sit in a position to really examine the agency's way of doing government work, and really shift for, like, asking government to shift how it does its work. And while it feels like such a New York thing to be like, we're doing this, we are surely, as New York City, not at the forefront of this. This is a movement in government across the nation, and many jurisdictions have undertaken efforts like mine. And so we are part of a community of government staff that are really working hard to change, like, institutions that are hundreds of years old, and ask them to really confront how every racist policy in the history of the United States still exists in the way that you actually function today.
Right, and thank you, Lisa, because that is no small feat, right? Working in a bureaucracy, in another bureaucracy, in a large sort of institution, it can definitely be challenging, especially like you said, sort of hundreds of years of institutions, practices to be sort of overturned in a generation is no small feat. So thank you for the work that you do. So we heard a little bit about why you do what you do within your answers as you talked about sort of your profession. I'm really interested in how, right? What was your roadmap? How did you get here? Tamara talked a lot about sort of the recent deaths of, Black men across the country, that sort of as she entered graduate school. But I'm really interested in hearing your story because a lot of people sometimes feel like they can't be passionate about something and also make a living, right? And sometimes your journey sort of brings you to a place that is not only becomes your profession, but also your love. So I'd love to hear a little bit about sort of how did you get where you are? Who wants to start? Lisa.
Thank you. I don't think it was ever an option for me to not do racial justice work. I'm an immigrant. I came here when I was 8. And even though I've been here most of my life, and they probably call me the 1.5 generation, nothing about my immigration experience ever sort of disappeared in my life in the United States. That outsider feeling that like you'll never quite belong is still very much a part of my identity. And I'm originally from Guyana, and coming from a nation that is considered part of the developing world and very poor, it's so hard for me not to think about the impact of racism, not just in the United States, but how the United States has moved in an imperialist way across the world, how it impacted movements in the Caribbean. I really appreciated Tamara's statement about liberation movements across the world. And as I think about that, I think a lot about the forces that even brought my family to the United States, and recognize that nothing about us being here is by choice. It is definitely a force of American imperialism that we are in this country. And so while I am here, I think that it is incumbent upon me, with the opportunity that I've been given, to really fight for justice, not just because it's important for the United States, but I think it has such broad global impact. Given my family origins, for me, this work is also about liberating my country, my home country, and really thinking about how this country can operate differently so that we don't have the kind of abuses that happen here and globally that actually impact people in such negative ways. And so for me, growing up and experiencing my immigration the way that I did, I just never saw my life amounting to anything other than doing racial justice work. And coming from the Caribbean, you can imagine that my family is also very, very mixed in a lot of ways. So when I'm watching TV, I'm watching news, and I'm watching people being murdered, that's also very real to me because it's also my family, right? It's not just like a theory. It's not this other group of people. This is deeply personal. I see faces that look like people I love, and it's hard for me to not want to do something about that. And so, so my immigration story, my experience growing up, is a big part of what brought me here. I never thought I'd be doing it in government, to be honest. I definitely had a very different path sort of charted for myself when I started my career, and just found that as I was starting to do some work in different organizations, that it just felt, I ended up kind of finding this position opening at the health department, and came in to do it. And I find it really satisfying to be thinking strategically about how institutions exist in the country. I've never actually thought about that as doing racial justice work before, because all of racial justice work in my mind had been on the ground work always. But feeling like there is a place to also think about government and how government actually can advance racial equity, because they hold so much power, and there is something there about really pushing government to relinquish that power. It's not easy, and I'd say that that's probably the biggest challenge of doing this kind of work, but it's also really important. Communities do it all the time, through community movements, kind of forcing governments to change the way it moves, and every movement has really applied that kind of pressure. And now I'm in a position to like be within it and try to bring that pressure from the outside in.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your journey and your history here. Before we continue with the question, I just want to remind the audience, if you'd like to ask questions, we're going to have a short Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions, and we will do our best to answer them live, or we will answer them through the Q&A function. Next, I'd like, I know Tiffany, you have a very profound story, and really would love to hear sort of your journey and your road to how'd you get to where you are.
Oh, y'all know we're gonna need more than 60 minutes.
We'll give us the bridge version.
Yeah, we're shorten it. But I appreciate what's emerging here. How I got here to this particular moment in time. I'm not sure if folks were able to either read some op-eds that I have that were published, or people looked into who I am, and things that I do. But I like to lead with being a former ward of New York State's child welfare system. I was taken away from my mother when I was 4 years old, and I grew up inside of New York City's foster care system from 4 up until the process ended for me when I was 22 years old. Mm-hmm. And I aged out without anything. And that's not to diminish nor minimize the caseworker or the case manager who had the best of all intentions to make sure that I had what I needed as they phased me out of the system. But I was put out without nothing. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that stayed with me was the fact that the system didn't even care to make sure that I had connections with the family that they took me from, right? Mm-hmm. So for many years, I had to build in a support system. And it was through that journey of doing it for myself. And with that, that's like finding love of self, finding family, finding community, finding a sense of belonging, that I was then led to academia. Mm-hmm. And while at City College, someone thought that my mind, my heart, my spirit was in the right place, and decided to give me an opportunity to do events coordinating for the Wellness and Counseling Center. And it was there that I was told to go out into the community and see what could pull the students' interests into the Wellness and Counseling Center and all the services that they offer. And through that, I didn't know at the time that that was a community assessment and that I was working to engage community, but I did it. And I talked to several of my peers across so many different disciplines, so many different majors, so many different interests, and realized that there was a huge portion of the student population that was homeless, right, and without. And there wasn't a place for them to come and talk about that. And so along with my colleagues, along with the leadership of student services, we were able to create an environment where people were able to come forward. And out of that, emerged a whole lot of good that came out of that. Single Stop showed up, HRA showed up, so folks were able to build, a benefit structure for themselves so that they can continue to eat healthy while they were engaging in their student affairs. But to keep that short, what then came out of that was someone handed me Dorothy Height's autobiography. And the person specifically said to me, I don't know if you know, but you got innate social work in you. And I was like, what are you talking about, right? Social work, automatically my mind goes trauma response. I don't know what you're talking about, you know, a social worker. But I sat with that. And not only did I sit with Traylon Holder's words, I also read the book. And Dorothy Height, what an incredible Black woman. I'm talking about centering Black feminism as the vanguard, right? What a gift. And in her life, she was running from the gift. Community kept bringing her in, and she was like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a doctor. No. At some point, she invited what was coming to her and became that. And so with that, I was led to apply to Hunter, and didn't apply to any of the other social work institutions. Applied there, and someone saw what I shared in that personal story, that what I was seeking was not just another place to belong, but how could I address the vulnerabilities that I see on a daily? How can I be a part of the solutions as opposed to anything else, right? And I know that it emanates from a place of being directly impacted. When you are and have faced those vulnerabilities, there's something about that. That's what Lisa was talking about in her story, right? And so I got there. I got to Hunter, and I realized that it was bigger than challenging the child welfare system. That what needed to happen was that there needed to be a full-on debunking, demystifying, and dismantling of what is told about us, right? What they say about us, what they say about how we take care of each other, what they say about how we show up for each other. And that's not to say that we don't have our challenges within, but people don't talk about the way that we love each other and how we love each other through it. And so that is where I am. Through my journey, that's where I am today. And that is the how that leads me every single day. Anytime that I'm called upon to show up, that's what I lead with. It's a love, it's a knowing, it's a being directly impacted. And it's because I know what's required here. And so that's my how.
Right. I love it. I love your sort of unconventional, non-traditional journey to social work. And I have a very similar story. We don't have enough time, so I'm not going to go through that, but the same experience about sort of going to, at the time it was Hunter School of Social Work. And I was like, what's a community organizer? I don't know what that is, right? Like, okay. But, you know, we often find ourselves in these unconventional spaces doing the work that we love to do and not recognizing the name that it's called or the profession that it's generally tied to. And, you know, again, Tamara, you talked a little bit about sort of, you know, how you started working on your senior thesis. And, you know, when BLM, when the Black Lives Matter first started, people didn't expect it to be a movement, right? It was just a bunch of random, you know, radical people upset in the streets. And, you know, now because of, you know, current events, you know, people are recognizing this, again, what started out as something unconventional to be this full-fledged movement that is moving the nation and the world. So, you know, I don't know if you want to add anything about sort of your how and how'd you get to the work that you're doing and all the spaces that you're doing it?
Sure. I think my sort of how really resonates with Lisa's story. I am the child of immigrants. Both of my parents are from Haiti, and they have what I think is a super common story in the States, where they were both the first from their families to make it to the United States. And with that sort of comes the mandate to provide for your family, bring over the family that you can so you can give them the access and resources that just aren't available in your home country. And to Lisa's point, your home country doesn't have access to safety and security and stable resources due to a history of colonialism and exploitation. And so you don't leave your home because you want to, but because you have to, and you have to seek opportunities elsewhere. So I remember being incredibly young, probably 7 or 8, and like, you know, if I was the kid around who, you know, spoke the best English or just was there, I'd be helping my, you know, family with immigration applications and phone calls to the Department of Homeland Security. And so I understood, watching my family's immigration process, that the government had this impact on my life that I could not control. And so it was important that I understood how to interact with the government and how to interact with politics, because it was going to mandate whether or not I got to see my family, whether or not I got to meet my grandparents and my aunts and uncles. So I sort of understood really early that whether or not I thought about politics, politics was going to think about me. And so when I got into school and I was in my social studies and histories classes, I kind of had the personal impetus to sort of just zone in and try to get it and understand it, because I had a clear example at home about how it was impacting my life. And that's why I had the opportunity to come into Hunter College so sure about what it is that I wanted to study, but I, like many students, didn't know what I wanted to do with that. And it was actually one of my politics professors, Professor Carolyn Somerville, who told me that I should consider academia as a path. It wasn't something that I thought of before. It wasn't something that I knew was a viable career path. And I had no idea how to start, and I had no idea how to think about it, but she played a part in being a mentor and making sure that I knew that if I wanted to sort of dedicate my time to studying and building community around the traditions of Black feminists and studying liberation and informing liberation movements, that this was a path that I could take that would ensure that I had employment and was not, you know, out on the streets, and I actually could do the work that I wanted and, you know, sustain myself as well. For the rest of the work that I found myself doing that was adjacent to that, I think similarly, it was about doing this work in a professional way, but also building community around it. So whether that meant starting book clubs, whether that meant starting sort of community organizing groups, I think what becomes really important or really apparent when you invest in the institution of universities and colleges is that, again, it is a system that is not at all detached from the system of white supremacy that is around us. And there is so many reasons why it is so important that folks who look like us and have our backgrounds and have our stories make it through these channels. There is the very practical reason that, you know, having access to these spaces ensures stability for folks in ways that they have never experienced stability in their family legacies. But also, when we think about who goes on to be our social workers and our government officials and the folks who are informing the institutions that shape the rest of our lives, they pass through these halls, and what they are learning and what they are producing and what is being passed down from sort of the ivory tower is important in deciding what happens, you know, in these institutions. And it is important that the ideas that folks deem as radical hopefully are just, you know, commonplace by the time someone makes it through an institution like Hunter College. I've had the privilege of being in a lot of different academic institutions throughout my life. I did public school from kindergarten to, you know, from kindergarten to my undergraduate degree. My first time being in a private institution was going to graduate school at Oxford. But again, understanding the access and privilege that the academy gives you just further motivates you to, one, do all that you can to dismantle the hierarchy that are within those institutions that don't allow people access, as well as making sure that those institutions change internally to ensure that the knowledge production that happens and the information that is being disseminated from those places are all tools that are going to inform the world in a positive way and ideally lend towards liberation.
Yeah, no. You know, I am enjoying the responses that I'm getting. So I'm going to take a little bit of privilege here. You know, this is, you know, a conversation on race, racism, and reform. So I'm going to shift a little bit for our last question, maybe before Q&A. So in recent memory, we've heard calls to action and we've seen social unrest in the wake of the murders of Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, and countless others, right? What feels different about the movement developing after the murder of George Floyd? How do we keep this momentum and turn the passion behind this protest into action? What are the action steps? What do you think can come out of this moment in time? And this is for whoever wants to answer. All right, Tiff. All right, Tiffany.
What I have found different in my experience of showing up to different actions, my experience of also showing up for jail support of folks who participated in the demonstrations that were specifically calling for a defunding of the NYPD, was that it was the first time I had ever experienced the ways in which people displayed and exhibited care for each other. I've never experienced anything like that. Just like Tamara, I was in grad school at the time of the killings of Mike Brown and Eric Gardner. And with the support of other students in the school, as well as across cohorts, folks worked to shut down the school for 2 days and to black it out because we needed a better response, right, from the institution about what was going on and what was happening in front of our eyes. And that it was more than we needing to have a conversation in the classroom, but do you see the death? And do you see us trudging through this and still having to work through being present as this system continues to traumatize us? And so this time, out of being in the streets during that moment and being in the streets through other things that had happened along the way, even when Erica Gardner sought to push forward and to make sure to hold the people accountable for what had happened to her father, I had not seen people take care of each other this way. I was fed, I was hydrated, I had all kinds of masks. I was able to sweat, take it off, throw it away. I was able, people were acknowledging each other with flowers and good words, supporting each other in unison, in song, in dance. I had never seen anything like that. And then when showing up for jail support, folks were there. Whatever resources they had, if I could Uber you home, I'm gonna Uber you home. But most importantly, folks that were doing jail support weren't just there doing jail support for folks who were involved in the actions. They were doing jail support for everybody. What it was like to experience somebody coming out of that nasty machine, that nasty carceral machine, and being greeted by, hey, do you need some hand wash? Do you need a water? Have you had anything to eat? Do you need a ride? And seeing their whole face and body language change, I've never seen anything like that, never. And I think what is present now, that may have gone amiss in the mix of us trying to work to address this injustice, work to push back against this oppression, is that we lose care, we lose sight sometimes. But for those that are showing up now, we understand it. We understand that care, at the center of care, at the center of sustainability in solidarity is care. So that's what's different for me.
Right. Does anyone else want to answer that?
I just want to add to that. I think, especially in this moment where we are in the midst of a sustained movement, and abolition is sort of the word of the day to sort of connect what Tiffany is saying about care to the understanding of what it means to be like an abolitionist in this moment. And it's about not just destroying the systems that we see are creating harm, but also investing in creating systems where we center human life and we focus on how to take care of each other. So I think one of the most tangible things that you can do right now is to move your resources, whatever those resources may be. So if that means supporting bail funds, if you are an attorney, lending your legal services, lending your expertise, lending your knowledge, donating, or working for mutual aid funds, whatever it may mean. There are so many ways right now to localize your care, to take care of the folks who are specifically in your community and in your neighborhood, on top of being part of sort of this national movement that's happening. So that would be sort of my advice to folks, is to just do an audit of your resources and see how you can take care of someone.
Yeah, I'm glad you followed up with that, because, we are in a very unique moment in time, and we have some really great momentum, and I'm always concerned about what's next, right? How do we garner sort of this energy? How do we garner this care, right? How do we look at sort of, disinvesting in these institutions and reinvesting in ones that are people focused, right? But what are the actual steps, and how do we organize around that to make that happen? It's always where I feel like we fall short. And I think, I don't know when we're going to have this moment in time again. Like, I don't know when this perfect storm of opportunity is going to happen, when the world has their eyes on us and supporting us in this country, for all, for the generations of people who have been, oppressed and disadvantaged for so many years. What's the solution? Where are the concrete steps? Where are the how-to manuals, the best practices? Who's leading those? And you guys can think about that for a little bit, and I expect an answer. No, I'm gonna get it. But I think it's something that always, where we tend to in the past have struggled. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think we have the opportunity to move resources around and invest in things, and it has to be a concerted effort to do that. I think someone wants to respond to Tamara.
Yeah, I was just going to say, while we do have, to face the issue of like the American attention span, and this being something that might fall out of public favor in the media soon, there are folks who are always doing this work. And I think it's important to make sure that you're following them and paying attention to the issues that they're raising, every day of the year. I think another important conversation that is starting to happen now is sort of who are we leaving in the gaps when we're talking about Black Lives Matter and we're talking about this movement against racial oppression. We've managed with the Black Lives Matter movement to rightfully and importantly highlight these sort of visceral deaths that happen at the hands of the police. And we've had to face years of watching these deaths play out on television and in the media, but there are deaths that happen and abuses that happen that never make it on camera, that happen behind closed doors. And I think specifically we're starting to have a conversation about Black women and how they face violence that, is not as visceral as sort of the police violence that happens in the street. And so there are a litany of people that you can follow, and maybe we can follow up with some resources about folks who are specifically doing that work to make sure that people are taken care of outside, but also behind closed doors.
Okay, after Tiffany, then we're going to open it up for a quick Q&A.
Of course. So the only thing that I want to second, because I think Tamara said that perfectly. I don't think that I have an answer in terms of what solutions do we have, what are next steps. But I do agree with Tamara around, for a lot of communities that are organizing around the ways in which they're vulnerable, those folks don't need nobody else recreating a wheel. They have a map on how to do this thing. So you find, and I've been saying this to the breakout groups for the last 3 weeks, right? Because it's been a reoccurring theme. How do we find each other? Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that is important for us to do is to figure out our love language, mm-hmm. and how to find each other. How do we locate each other amongst and in the midst of this chaos? And I want to end with this quote, if it's okay, Professor Miller, around what Satima Clark said many, many moons ago when she was doing the same thing, looking to find people and to have those conversations with folks that were trying to join the movement. And what she said is, I have a great belief in the fact that whenever there is chaos, it creates wonderful thinking. And I want us to think about how communities that do have several vulnerabilities, how they're talked about, right? It's like seeing chaos, but know that there's so much beauty, so much care, so much love amongst the other things that's happening too. And she goes on to say, I consider chaos a gift. I too consider chaos a gift. I think if we all were to begin to look at it that way, we'll talk about folks' vulnerabilities differently, and we'll show up in ways to help dismantle and demolish those vulnerabilities very differently.
Thank you. And before I turn it over to Mac, he's going to kill me. Lisa, did you have any last words?
No, they said everything, so I don't want to delay Q&A anymore.
All right, well, thank you. I mean, you guys were phenomenal. Now we're gonna turn it over to Mac, and he is going to facilitate some Q&A for us.
Hello, everybody. Yes, we have some good questions that have come in during the course of the conversation, and I'll share some of those with you now. Here's a question from Devashish Basnet. First, she mentions that this question is inspired by a point you were making, Tamara, about the inherent nature of institutions rooted in white supremacy. And then the question for the panel is, can the conditions created by institutional racism be transformed within the existing capitalist order?
I can maybe start to take a swing at that. Audre Lorde is one of our favorite Hunter alumni, and Audre Lorde is famous for saying the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. So when we think about institutions that are rooted in white supremacy, there is a conversation to be had between sort of reform and abolition, or some folks frame it as like non-reformist reforms, which I know sounds a little convoluted, but gets to the point about how you can make changes that shift the focus, and how that does create foundational change. So a lot of these institutions that we think about that are rooted in white supremacy, the focus of the institution is garnering capital, is entrenching hierarchy. So when you shift the focus and you shift the goals of an institution to be more human-focused, human-centered, focused on actually providing access and not specifically aimed towards capital, you're doing what's good for people versus what's good for your bottom line. Those are this type of sort of non-reformist reforms that actually do start to make change, and those things can happen within the institution. I think what folks run into a lot, and I absolutely run into this when I have contentions with even the institution that I'm currently at and trying to change things, is that some folks are not willing to make changes that will disavow them of their power. So if you want to, from within an institution, commit to change, I think it also means committing to the idea that fundamentally what you are a part of will not look the same at the end, and that is the ideal. And if that means that whatever privilege or power that you had access to because of your role in that institution is also diminished, that is the goal. And it's not something that folks should be actively trying to prevent when thinking about how to change things.
That was amazing. And I would just add that when we talk about capitalism, that capital part, like what we are talking about is land and labor, right? And that labor piece is really crucial because labor is stolen from people, it's bodies. Like the bodies is really what comprises that labor. And being a descendant of the labor class, people who were literally moved from one land to another land to do work on plantations, that sits with me heavily. And as I think about the work that I do, there is nothing about liberation or the kind of liberation that I imagine that can be achieved if we are committed to maintaining capitalism. So if we are committed to power and hierarchy the way that we know it, if I'm committed to constantly rising through hierarchy and maintaining hierarchy in the institutions I'm at in exactly the way they exist, I will never actually get to the kind of liberation that I want. And so I love that Tamara mentioned that we really have to start to break with what we think of as achievement, as growth, and really start to redefine those things and imagine a world that is that we want to live in. Because even as I think about this as at a personal level, that even if I were to just work within the system I'm in and rise through the ranks and in the hierarchy of whatever institution I work in, and attain a really powerful position, is that satisfying? And ultimately, when I think about that, I'm like, nothing about that life is actually satisfying. Nothing about it actually gets me to the place, or the people I love to the place that I'd like for us all to be in. What I want is to be freely in community with my people, and imagining that world. So when we are in these movements, we really have to start to take that apart, take capitalism apart, and commit to a very different vision of the world that we want.
Okay, here's another question from the audience from Denise Goodman. She asks, how can we expand the engagement of young people and other marginalized individuals in this momentum and help to transfer leadership skills? No takers? That's a tough one.
I don't think it's so much tough. Sometimes folks just don't work with young people, right? But she asked, how can we expand the engagement of young people and other marginalized individuals? I think it has a lot to do with not just the way in which that we approach our young people. I think it also has a lot to do with what kind of spaces are created that would give room and all the space that's needed for them to be able to speak to what's happening for them, what's coming up, what they're seeing. On May 2nd of this year, and folks probably know a lot of the events that happened throughout the city, my younger 27-year-old cousin and 19 other young Black men and boys were caught up in an NYPD sweep. All 20 of them were arrested together and held for over 8 hours for nothing, for absolutely nothing. And what came out of that was, I'm traumatized. This young people were saying, I'm traumatized by, it felt like I was kidnapped. Now, there aren't, right? Not just in the midst of COVID, but even prior to COVID, there weren't a lot of spaces for young people to talk about what was coming up for them as they navigate through the world and have to deal with the presence, the constant presence of the police and what that means for them. So I say that just as an example around, I think how we engage the young people is to really understand the ways in which they're impacted and make sure that we're creating space for them to share what's coming up for them and how their experience, how they're living their experience.
Unless anybody else wants to touch on that question, I believe we need to get to the breakout rooms shortly. So any final thoughts, Melva or anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm not a panelist, but so I think you're absolutely right, Tiffany. You know, I think the most important thing I would say, especially for young people and younger generations, is to just get out of their way, right? Create the space and get out of their way, because if we look at sort of the social movements of history, especially what's happening now, young people are affected by all of the issues that, you know, that are happening, right? Whether it's food insecurity, whether it's affordable housing, right? Whether it's, you know, youth violence, gun violence, whatever the traumas that are happening in communities, right? All of the things that us older generations are dealing with, young people are dealing with them as well. And it's affecting them differently. And, you know, what I'm so proud of, you know, the millennials and the Gen Zs, right? The younger generations, is that they're not waiting for us to lead them, right? They are very clear about sort of what it is that they want. They're very clear about how they're going to get it. I mean, you know, I've been working on the 2020 census, and we've been working with cultural influencers and social media influencers. And, I met a young woman who is 20 years old, and she was so clear about her role and what she's doing. Like, I was floored. So I think the best thing we can do is give them that space, give them that environment, and get out of their way. Empower them to sort of lead and trust that they can lead, and we should follow.
I think we'll have a short announcement from Misha Smith now. Misha?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mac. And I want to thank all of our panelists. You were all so amazing, so moving, so inspiring. And they're all Hunter products. So like, this could be you one day to all the students watching. So please stay engaged, keep joining us. And so again, I want to thank Melva, Tamara, Tiffany, Lisa for taking the time out of your busy schedules. All of these people work today, and they still came on this panel to talk to you. So thank you all. And next week, we're really excited for our program. We are going to be talking about code.